Welcome, dear listeners. I'm host Name from Warm Pages, and I'm so glad you're here tonight. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from. I love reading every one of them. Don't forget to subscribe. We share new Miss Marple stories every single day. Now, make yourself comfortable with a warm drink, and let's begin tonight's mystery. It was the kind of December morning that made Street Mary Mead look almost painted, frost on every gatepost, smoke curling from cottage chimneys, and in the middle of it all the village hall full of noise, chatter, and the faint smell of cinnamon. Lady Dolly Bantry stood near the trestle table, directing operations as though commanding a regiment. Not the red ribbons, Mabel, the silver. Christmas should sparkle, not shout. Mabel Knox, loyal and slightly flustered, nodded and changed them without a word. At another table, Lily Veen and Clive Perkins were unpacking a box of paper lanterns, half of them tangled, half torn. Clive sighed. Same every year. You'd think the council stored them in a jungle. Lily smiled faintly. It wouldn't be Street Mary Mead if things worked properly. Mrs. Dodds, the caretaker, hovered nearby with her clipboard. She took her duties seriously. Too seriously, some said. Everyone's names are here, she announced, tapping the list. Choir at 6, raffle at 7, carols at 8, everything in order. Or so it seemed, because a moment later, Miss Marple herself entered quietly through the side door. Neat coat, sensible shoes, a small parcel tucked under one arm. She always arrived early to observe, as much as to help. "Ah, Jane," called Lady Bantry. "You'll have tea, won't you? You look frozen solid." Miss Marple smiled. "A small cup, my dear, just enough to thaw the fingers." She took a seat by the window where she could see the street, and incidentally, everyone else in the hall. From her vantage point, she watched as Reverend Clement arrived, carrying a brown envelope. He seemed in a hurry. Griselda said, "You'd need the final program," he said, handing it to Mrs. Dodds. She opened it, frowning slightly. "That can't be right. The timing's all wrong. The carols are listed before the raffle." Lady Bantry turned, amused. Perhaps the Reverend's typewriter caught cold, but Mrs. Dodds shook her head. "I typed the schedule myself. This one's different. The headings look here, the E's are raised." She held the papers up for the group to see. "Someone's retyped the whole order." The laughter in the hall softened. Even Lady Bantry stopped fussing with her ribbons. Clive frowned. "But why would anyone bother?" Lily said quietly, "It's only a schedule." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting, voice mild. "Ah, my dear, people rarely alter things for nothing. When small details change, it's usually because something larger depends on them." The others exchanged puzzled glances. Lady Bantry chuckled, trying to dispel the unease. "Good heavens, Jane, you make it sound sinister." Miss Marple smiled faintly, almost to herself. "Sinister, no, but deliberate, perhaps." A draft lifted the corner of the strange new program. The clock struck 11, and for the first time that morning, the room felt colder. Miss Marple folded her knitting, eyes distant. "No, my dear," she murmured softly, "not unless someone wanted it to." The first small change in the village routine, and the first thread of trouble pulled loose. By late afternoon, the village hall glowed like a lantern. Paper stars hung from the ceiling. The stage curtain had been ironed. Even the floor smelled faintly of polish and pine. Clive Perkins was crouched by the socket under the piano, grumbling to himself as usual. Faulty wiring again. Half these plugs were made when Queen Victoria still ruled. Mrs. Dodds hovered over him, clutching her clipboard. "Just make sure it works, Mr. Perkins. The Christmas tree lights must go on at 6 sharp. Reverend's orders." Across the room, Lady Bantry arranged silver baubles with the precision of a jeweler. Mabel Knox trailed behind her with a dustpan. "Don't step there, Mabel. You'll crush the tinsel." "Yes, my lady." The old clock above the piano chimed 5. The sound was swallowed by laughter, chatter, and the rustle of coats. Then, just as the Reverend entered with a smile, everything went black. The lights flickered once, hissed, and died. Darkness. A few gasps, a single scream, then silence, broken only by Lady Bantry's sharp voice. "Oh, not again. Every year some calamity." Clive muttered something unprintable and reached for his torch. Fuse gone. I told you this wiring's older than Methuselah. Mrs. Dodd stood rigid, clutching her list. This wasn't supposed to happen. We had the electrician in last week. Reverend Clement tried to sound calm. Everyone, please, stay where you are. No panic. Someone bumped into the tree. Baubles clinked. A faint smell of smoke drifted from near the stage. Smoke? Said Lady Bantry sharply. No, just the candles, replied Mabel. I lit them when the lights went. Miss Marple, who had been quietly knitting at the edge of the room, set her needles down and rose. Candles? She repeated softly. Which ones, dear? Mabel pointed toward the long table by the stage. 6 white candles stood there, burning steadily. Miss Marple moved closer, her eyes thoughtful in the dim flicker. Something caught her attention. The wax was running not toward the table's edge, but backward, against the lean of the stand. How curious, she murmured. Lady Bantry turned. What's curious now, Jane? Miss Marple bent slightly, studying the hardened drips. These stands always tilt toward the east wall. They've done so for years, yet the wax has flowed west tonight. Clive shone his torch toward her. Means what exactly? That someone moved the table, she said quietly, after the candles were lit. The Reverend frowned. Moved it? But why? Miss Marple gave a small smile. That, my dear Reverend, is the interesting part. At that moment, Dr. Haydock entered, coat dusted with frost, his face red from the cold. Power failure, is it? I saw the whole place go dark from the road. Clive gestured toward the socket. Blown fuse. I'll have to fetch a replacement from the shop. Best hurry, said Haydock. Half the village depends on this haul tonight. Inspector Slack appeared just then, summoned by someone's anxious message. He looked around, unimpressed. Lights out, candles smoking, half the county flapping. Typical Christmas Eve. Lady Bantry sniffed. Perhaps you'll tell us who planned it, Inspector. He gave a thin smile. Planned? More likely neglect, madam. Always is. Miss Marple glanced at him. Her tone was mild, but her eyes sharp. Things do fail, yes, she said softly, but not usually all at once. Slack raised an eyebrow. Meaning? She resumed her seat, fingers folding her knitting with quiet precision. It never goes wrong all at once, she said, unless someone planned it. The candles flickered. The hall stayed silent, and outside, the church clock struck 6:15 minutes late. The darkness wasn't an accident, it was the first step in someone's plan. By 6:30, the lights were back, but the peace was gone. Clive Perkins had replaced the fuse, muttering darkly about village antiques. Yet the tension in the hall lingered like a draft. Lady Bantry tried to restore order. Everyone, carry on. It's only a hiccup. The show must go on. Her tone was firm, but her earrings trembled as she spoke. Mrs. Dodds checked her clipboard again, lips pursed. If we hurry, we can still begin on time. But as she said it, the Christmas tree beside her gave a strange rustle. Then, without warning, toppled. Baubles shattered. Needles flew. A child screamed. Reverend Clement barely caught the angel before it hit the floor. Good heavens, cried Lady Bantry. Who tied this thing? Clive groaned. I did, or thought I did. He inspected the stand. The screws were half unscrewed. Somebody's loosened them, he said grimly. Not by accident either. Before anyone could answer, a second noise joined the chaos, a scuffle near the stage curtains. Mabel gasped. The kitten's out again. The vicar's cat, belonging more to the parish than the clergy, darted through the tangle of ribbons and wires, chased by 2 choir boys. Catch it, Peter. I'm trying. It shot beneath the tables, knocking a tray of mince pies straight into Mrs. Dodds's lap. The old woman stood, trembling with fury. This is sabotage, she declared, shaking her dripping clipboard. Dr. Haydock appeared again from the corridor. Coat off now. Sleeves rolled. No one's hurt, I trust. Only my nerves, said Lady Bantry. If one more thing goes wrong, a sharp metallic sound interrupted her. It came from the entrance. A clang followed by silence. Mrs. Dodds turned pale. "The church bell," she whispered. "Someone's taken it down." Reverend Clement frowned. "The handbell?" But it was on the table this morning. They searched. The polished brass bell used to call the choir was gone. Miss Marple's soft voice broke through the murmurs. "Interesting," she said almost to herself. "The bell was polished yesterday. I remember the gleam, but now it's missing altogether." Lady Bantry folded her arms. "Well, Jane, perhaps it ran off with the kitten." A few nervous laughs followed, but Marple didn't smile. She was staring at the empty space on the table, a perfect, round mark of cleaner's wax, glowing faintly under the new electric light. "Odd," she murmured. "Fresh polish. And now, fresh trouble. Doctor." Haydock crouched beside the fallen tree, examining the loose screws. "These weren't stripped by accident," he said. "See the pattern? Turned twice, stopped, then reversed. Someone wanted it to fall, but not too soon." Reverend Clement sighed. "Are we to suspect mischief in every direction?" Miss Marple looked up, eyes mild but focused. "Not mischief," she said quietly. "Method." Inspector Slack entered just in time to hear it. "You again, Miss Marple? Seeing villains in every puddle?" "Not villains," she replied gently. "Just human nature, and human nature seldom stays tidy." Slack frowned, but she said no more. Instead, she reached for one of the candles still burning on the refreshments table. The flame fluttered as the door opened behind her, a gust of cold air, a hiss, and one by one, the candles wavered. Only one kept burning. Small, steady, stubborn. Miss Marple watched it for a long moment. "A candle never tells you when it's about to die," she said softly. "It simply does." 3 small disasters, one invisible hand behind them, and only one light left. The village hall had barely recovered from the last disaster when a new one began. It started small, a hum beneath the chatter, faint as wind through the rafters. Then, without warning, the organ burst into life. A roar of pipes shook the walls. The sound wasn't music. It was chaos, a jumble of notes, thunder in the air. The decorations quivered. The floor vibrated. Several villagers covered their ears. "Turn it off," shouted Lady Bantry. Clive ran toward the corner where the organ blower switch was kept, but the noise grew louder. "It's stuck," he shouted back. "It won't stop." Reverend Clement tried to calm the crowd. "Please, everyone, stay still. It's only the motor." No one listened. Voices rose over the mechanical roar. Children began to cry. The kitten screeched and vanished under the chairs. Miss Marple sat perfectly still in her corner, her knitting on her lap, eyes half closed. She was counting 1, 2, 3, the rhythm of the chaos. Then she opened her eyes and scanned the room. Mrs. Dodds by the door. Clive near the switchboard. Dr. Haydock steadying the trembling choir boys, Lady Bantry ushering the frightened children toward the back. Everyone visible, except one. Mrs. Price, the church warden, was gone. Miss Marple stood slowly, using the noise as cover. She moved along the wall toward the vestry door. The key was missing from its hook. She looked up. The door stood slightly ajar, swinging with each vibration of the organ's furious breath. Clive finally managed to wrench the main switch. The roar faltered, coughed, and died. For a moment, the silence felt heavier than the noise, then a scream. It came from somewhere beyond the vestry. Sharp, startled, and cut short. Reverend Clement spun around. "Good Lord, what now?" Lady Bantry clutched his arm. That was a woman's voice. Dr. Haydock was already moving, torch in hand. "Stay where you are," he ordered. Miss Marple followed a few steps behind him. The corridor beyond the vestry was narrow, lit only by a single candle that had fallen onto its side, spilling wax across the floor. They reached the tower door. Locked. Dr. Haydock rattled the handle. Someone's bolted it from inside. He stepped back, shoulder set, ready to break it down, but before he could, a low sound reached them through the thick stone wall, a slow, sliding scrape. Then a thud, then another, something heavy rolling downstairs, then stillness. Inspector Slack arrived just as Haydock forced the door. "Out of the way!" he barked, shoving past. What in blazes happened here? No one answered. The candle guttered in the parted draught. Miss Marple's face was pale, her eyes fixed on the dark stairwell that wound upward into the tower. She spoke softly, more to herself than to anyone else. Too much noise, too many shadows. Perfect cover for something quiet. Slack glanced at her, frowning. What kind of something? She didn't look at him. Instead, she tilted her head toward the darkness. From far above, one last sound echoed, dull, final, unmistakable. A body hitting stone. Then silence. A thud echoed from the tower, followed by silence. The air inside the tower was colder than the hall. Stone walls pressed in, smelling of dust and candle wax. Inspector Slack led the way upward, torch beams slicing through the dark spiral. Each step creaked beneath his boots. Halfway up, the beam froze on something motionless. A man's shoe, then a leg, then the rest of him. Mr. Lionel Carraway, the temporary organist, the man who spoke like a sermon and smiled like a ledger, lay twisted on the stone landing, his neck bent at an impossible angle. His glasses, cracked, hung from one ear. Dr. Haydock dropped to his knees beside the body, movements quiet and precise. He felt the pulse none. He checked the angle of the head, the bruising on the temple, the stiffness of the limbs. Neck's broken, he said softly. Clean break. Instant. He looked at Slack. Must have fallen backward from the second turn of the stairs. Slack straightened, expression grim. Darkness, noise, confusion. It fits. Poor devil must have slipped. He scribbled in his notebook. Accidental fall. Nothing more to it. Miss Marple stood a few steps below, her knitting bag clutched loosely in one hand. She said nothing. Her eyes, pale and sharp, roamed the stairwell, the railing, the steps, the scattered dust. Then she leaned forward slightly, gaze fixed on the edge of the banister. "Doctor," she said quietly, "would you shine the light here, please?" Haydock obeyed. The torch caught a thin smear of something metallic along the rail, faint, glinting. He rubbed it with his gloved finger and frowned. Brass polish. Fresh, too. Slack frowned. Polish? From the rail? Miss Marple tilted her head. Or from something that struck it? The inspector sighed. "Miss Marple, please don't start seeing mysteries where there aren't any." He fell. You can tell by the position. She didn't argue. She looked at the steps again. One candle had rolled from the upper level and rested halfway down, its flame still trembling. The wax had spilled across the stone, forming uneven lines. The drips ran in one direction, then suddenly bent the other way as if the candle had been lifted, turned and replaced. Miss Marple noted it silently, then turned to the doctor. "Would you say he died instantly, doctor?" Haydock hesitated. "Yes, but the bruise on his temple, see the shape? That's curved, almost circular." She nodded once. "Like the rim of a bell, perhaps." Slack exhaled loudly. "A bell? Now really, Miss Marple, this isn't one of your novels." The man tripped. He gestured toward the narrow steps. "Look at this place. Anyone could lose their footing." Marple didn't answer. Her gaze had drifted upward, toward the rope of the tower bells swaying faintly from the draught, then back down to the small trail of scuffed dust leading from the landing to the wall, and a faint shoe print turned sideways. Someone had stood there just long enough. "Doctor?" Haydock closed his bag and rose slowly. "We'd best move him now. He's been gone about 20 minutes, no more." Slack nodded, signaling to the constable waiting below. Miss Marple followed them down in silence. Her thoughts were turning over like the gears of a clock. Back in the hall, the villagers huddled together in uneasy clusters. Lady Bantry clutched a cup of tea she'd poured but forgotten to drink. Mrs. Dodds wept quietly near the fallen tree. The air still smelled faintly of polish, sweet, sharp, unmistakable. Reverend Clement tried to speak words of comfort, but his voice trembled. "Christmas Eve," he said softly. "How can such things happen here?" Miss Marple didn't answer. She took a seat beside the tea table, folded her knitting, and began winding the yarn again tight, measured, exact. Then, as if to herself, she said, "Most things can be set right. if one understands what went wrong. The sound of her needles clicked once. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, and somewhere above, the bell rope moved faintly, as though remembering what it had done. The village believes it an accident. Miss Marple knows better. By morning, Street Mary Mead had gone quiet. Frost still clung to the hedges, but the hall smelled faintly of extinguished candles and cold tea. The decorations hung limp, the laughter of the previous day long gone. Inspector Slack stood by the doorway, flipping through his notes with the weariness of a man who had already decided his verdict. "Unfortunate accident," he muttered. "Wet boots, poor lighting, end of story." Dr. Haydock disagreed, though he said little. He was examining the bruise again in memory. Curved, sharp, edged, too clean for a fall. But he knew better than to argue with Slack when Miss Marple was in the room. She sat quietly near the fireplace, her knitting untouched. Her mind was working. The pieces had begun to fit. One candle, one bell, one man dead. Lady Bantry arrived first, bringing her usual mixture of confidence and concern. "I still say something's off," she declared. "That organ was roaring long before anyone reached the tower. Who turned it on?" "Mrs. Dodds, pale and trembling, replied, "No one touched it. The switch is kept in the vestry cupboard." Miss Marple looked up at that. "And who has the key to the cupboard?" Mrs. Dodds hesitated. "Only the warden, Mrs. Price." A quiet fell. Everyone turned toward the door as Mrs. Price entered, clutching her leather account book like a shield. She was composed, almost too composed. "The police have asked for a list of the offertory totals," she said. "I thought it best to bring it personally." Slack nodded curtly, taking the book. "Appreciate the cooperation." He flipped it open, scanning the neat columns. Receipts, amounts, signatures, all correct until one page showed faint erasure marks where numbers had been rewritten. He frowned. "You've been adjusting these." Mrs. Price drew herself up. "Simple corrections, Inspector. Ink blotting. Nothing more." Miss Marple had risen by now, moving toward the choir stalls. Her eyes drifted to the gap beneath one of the benches, a small space where something white caught the light. She bent down and withdrew a folded sheet of paper, edges crinkled, faintly dusted with candle soot. "Reverend," she said softly, "would you mind telling me whose typewriter this resembles?" Reverend Clement adjusted his glasses. "That's from the church office. See the raised E? It's our old Remington." Slack sighed. "More typing trouble. I suppose it's another schedule?" "It is," Miss Marple replied. "The original one Mrs. Dodds prepared. The one she said had been replaced." She unfolded it beside the altered copy still pinned on the notice board. Side by side, the difference was clear, every event pushed back by exactly 15 minutes. Lady Bantry leaned over. "Whoever changed it wanted everyone in the wrong place." Miss Marple nodded. "And for a specific length of time." Inspector Slack crossed his arms. "Coincidence? Anyone could have mistyped it." Miss Marple's voice stayed calm. "Oh no, Inspector. This was deliberate. 15 minutes isn't random. It's the gap between the lights failing and the scream from the tower." Mrs. Price's hands tightened around her gloves. "You're implying I—" Miss Marple interrupted gently. "You were in the vestry, my dear, were you not? The only one with the key. The only one who could reach both the organ switch and the tower door without being seen." Her voice was kind, almost sympathetic, but the words hung heavy. "Doctor," Haydock glanced toward Slack, whose expression had hardened. "Now see here," the inspector said. "We've no proof of anything except a clumsy night and a broken neck." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Then perhaps proof lies in the small things. The candle wax that ran backward, the polish on the railing, the missing bell, the raised letter on a forged schedule." Slack tapped his notebook. "You think you can time a murder by typewriter keys?" Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "You can time anything, Inspector, if you know what was moved, when, and why." The silence that followed was thick. Even the clock seemed to hesitate before chiming. "Mrs." Price turned toward the window, her face pale. "Ridiculous. she said too quickly. Why would anyone bother? Miss Marple's voice lowered. Because 15 minutes, Mrs. Price, is just long enough to hide a crime. The hall went silent. Only the faint ticking of the clock broke the stillness. And outside, snow began to fall slow, deliberate, covering everything it touched. 15 minutes, just long enough to hide a crime. The church was empty again by nightfall. No choir, no laughter, no whispers of gossip. Only candlelight trembling against stone. Inspector Slack had locked up and left, muttering that he'd heard enough theories for one Christmas. But Miss Marple had asked for permission to stay. Just to tidy the hymn sheets, she had said. He'd agreed, mostly to be rid of her questions. And so, when the clock struck 11, Street Mary Mead Church was silent except for the faint clicking of her knitting needles. Sergeant Lake, posted at her request, sat 2 pews behind her. He was young, polite, and quietly skeptical. You truly think someone will come back, ma'am? Oh, yes, she said softly. Guilt rarely sleeps through its first night. They waited. The wind outside brushed the stained glass, sighing like a restless soul. Midnight crept closer, then the faint squeal of a key turning in the outer lock. Sergeant Lake stiffened. Miss Marple didn't move. Not yet, she whispered. Let's see who it is. The heavy door opened. A shaft of cold moonlight fell across the aisle. Mrs. Price stepped inside. Her face was pale in the dim light, her hands clutching a parcel wrapped in brown paper. She closed the door carefully, glancing around. Then she moved toward the vestry, her footsteps careful, deliberate. Lake whispered, "What's she doing?" Miss Marple replied, finishing what she started. They watched in silence as Mrs. Price knelt near the offertory box. She opened her handbag, drew out a screwdriver, and began to loosen the screws around the brass plate. Her movements were practiced, almost mechanical. After a few minutes, she reached into the box and withdrew a small envelope. She tore it open, shook out several papers, then struck a match. The faint hiss of fire filled the still air as she dropped the flame into the brazier used for burning waste decorations. It flared bright for a moment, a brief, guilty glow before fading to smoke. Miss Marple rose, her knitting still in her hand. "Sergeant," she said quietly, "if you would, please." Lake stepped forward, his boots echoing on the flagstones. "Mrs. Price," he said firmly, "I'll have to ask you to stop that." The church warden gasped, stumbling to her feet. The matchbook fell from her hand. "Sergeant Lake," she stammered. "What are you doing here?" "Same as you, ma'am," he replied. "Watching." Miss Marple came closer, her expression calm, her voice kind. "Good evening, Mrs. Price. I did wonder whether you'd return." Mrs. Price backed away a step. "I was only tidying up. There were documents left unsecured." Marple's eyes drifted to the brown paper parcel now resting on the vestry table. "May I?" she said softly, lifting the package before Mrs. Price could protest. Inside lay a pair of small metal snips, their blades faintly gilded with gold dust. A length of wire, cut cleanly at both ends. A torn sheet of typed paper showing service times the forged schedule, and a single bell muffle, right-handed, polished bright. "Ah, yes," Miss Marple murmured. "That explains everything." Mrs. Price pressed a hand to her mouth. "You don't understand?" Marple didn't raise her voice. "I think I do. You feared discovery. You hid the truth behind small errors, timed so neatly that no one would see what truly mattered." Sergeant Lake stepped forward. "You'll need to come with me, ma'am." Tears welled in Mrs. Price's eyes. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that. He was only meant to be frightened. He said he'd expose me. He was going to open the accounts." Marple's voice stayed gentle. "And you struck him. Once. Just enough to stop him. Then the stairs finished the rest." Mrs. Price's sob echoed against the stone. "He made it sound so simple. Honesty, accountability. But he didn't know how desperate I was." Miss Marple folded the paper again, hands steady. "Desperation makes people rather inventive, but it doesn't make them innocent." The brazier still smoked beside them. Lake stamped out the embers with his boot. Miss Marple watched the final curl of smoke rise toward the ceiling. "Midnight," she said quietly. "The hour when everything seems clear, until morning brings the details back to life." The church bell creaked once in the rafters, moving with the draught. A dull chime followed, soft, but heavy. And then silence again. "May I?" she said softly, lifting the package. "Ah, yes, that explains everything." The next morning, the village hall was still and cold. Frost rimed the windows. The faint scent of candle smoke lingered in the air. Inspector Slack stood at the center table, scowling at the heap of evidence spread before him. Wire snips, a brown parcel, 2 altered schedules, a half-burned ledger page. Dr. Haydock leaned against the wall, arms folded. Lady Bantry sat nearby, clutching her teacup like a lifeline. Mrs. Price stood apart, pale, motionless, eyes down. Miss Marple, calm as ever, began to speak. "Let us go through it slowly," she said. "Piece by piece. It's rather simple, really, once you know what to look for." She picked up the wire snips first. These were used on the bell rope, just enough to weaken the strand so it would fail under weight. She gestured toward the tower window. Mr. Carroway was standing there, tightening the muffle. When he leaned back, the rope gave way. The fall did the rest. Inspector Slack frowned. "And the organ? That racket started it all." Marple smiled faintly. "Indeed, the organ switch is kept in the vestry cupboard, locked, of course. Only Mrs. Price had the key. She turned it on remotely, using the auxiliary feed she'd arranged last week. Clever, but not wise." Mrs. Price's lips trembled. "I only meant to cause a fright to stop him from opening the accounts." Marple nodded gently, as though she'd expected the answer. "Ah, yes, the ledger." She lifted the scorched paper, edges curling from last night's failed fire. "Mr. Carroway had discovered discrepancies, missing funds from the Christmas fund, I believe. He confronted you in the tower before rehearsal. You argued. You struck him with the small handbell. He fell. Panic took the rest." Dr. Haydock's voice was low. "That explains the curved bruise." "Precisely," said Marple. And afterward she loosened the screws on the tree stand so attention would turn to minor accidents. She switched the schedule to delay the choir, creating that 15-minute gap between noise and discovery. Every mishap masked the next. Slack muttered, "All that trouble for a few stolen pounds." Marple's eyes softened. "No, Inspector, not for money. For pride. Mrs. Price was the warden here for 20 years. She feared humiliation more than prison. A little mistake in the accounts. It grew larger in the dark." Mrs. Price spoke then, a whisper more than words. "I didn't mean for him to die. He threatened to tell the Reverend. Said I'd ruined the church's good name. I only wanted to scare him. Make him drop it. I thought the bell would ring, not—" Her voice broke. Marple folded her hands. "Fear is a terrible companion, my dear. It makes clever people foolish and honest people reckless." She turned toward Slack. "The evidence speaks clearly enough. Rope fibers on the snips, polish residue from the railing, ink matching the forged schedule. Every part fits." Slack closed his notebook. "It fits all right. Too neatly for my liking. But I can't argue with facts." Lady Bantry sighed. "It's Christmas, Jane. Couldn't we have had one season without tragedy?" Miss Marple looked down at the wire snips glinting in the light. "Tragedy doesn't choose its season," she said softly. "And desperation makes people remarkably creative." The wind rattled the windows. No one spoke again. Desperation makes people remarkably creative. Dawn crept softly over Street Mary Mead. The snow had stopped, leaving the village washed in pale light. The church bells were silent, one missing. One cracked, yet the air felt still again, as if exhaling after a long-held breath. Inside the vicarage, the fire burned low. Lady Bantry sat with a shawl over her shoulders, staring into the embers. "Reverend." Clement poured tea, his movements slow, deliberate. Dr. Haydock stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, and Miss Marple, calm as always, stirred her cup once, twice, then let the spoon rest. "It's remarkable," said Lady Bantry finally, How quiet things look after so much noise. Miss Marple smiled faintly. That's human nature, my dear. We return to calm as soon as we can. It's the only way to bear the truth. Reverend Clement nodded. I can't help thinking of her Mrs. Price. She served the church faithfully for years. Faithfully, repeated Miss Marple softly, until fear replaced faith. Pride is such a small thing at first, until it grows teeth. No one spoke for a while. The clock ticked on the mantel. Outside, the first villagers began sweeping their steps, pretending life had never wavered. Dr. Haydock turned from the window. You saw it all before we did, Jane. How? Oh, not all, she said lightly. Just the pattern. The small things people think don't matter. A table moved an inch. Wax running the wrong way. Time itself rearranged. Most crimes announce themselves, you know, if one listens properly. Lady Bantry gave a tired smile. Listening has always been your gift. Miss Marple looked at her knitting bag. It's rather like knitting, really. One wrong stitch spoils the pattern, but it also shows where to begin again. They drank in silence for a moment longer. The fire crackled softly. Then Miss Marple stood smoothing her coat. I must see to the choir children later, she said. It wouldn't do to leave them thinking Christmas has lost its meaning. Reverend Clement looked up. And what meaning do you think remains, Miss Marple? She paused by the door, eyes kind but clear. Oh, I think truth always leaves something behind, even when it hurts. It reminds us that good and evil both live in very ordinary places. The others watched as she stepped outside. The snow glowed underfoot, the rooftops lined with frost. Somewhere down the lane, a milk cart creaked, and a robin landed on the church fence, tiny, defiant, alive. Miss Marple looked toward the bell tower, its shadow long across the green. In Street Mary Mead, she murmured, peace returns quickly, but truth never leaves quietly. She turned then, her figure small against the pale light, and walked home through the still morning. Behind her, the church door closed with a soft click like a secret finally at rest. Thank you for listening to a Miss Marple mystery. In Street Mary Mead. Every truth hides in plain sight, until someone dares to look closer. If you enjoyed tonight's story, don't forget to subscribe, share, and tell us where you're listening from. Until our next mystery, stay curious.